the occasion for this breakout is reporting on something that really follows up some activities that we've been talking about at the conference for some time. So the big picture is there's a need and opportunity for more research on the interplay of disability and technology generally, but of course our interest here is specifically in technology and cognitive disabilities, and I'm happy to see some of the current players there. But we've thought for a while that there's a need and opportunity to kind of raise the game in this space, to look farther out. But also, one of the themes, as you'll see, of what we tried to do in the workshop, in the meeting we'll be telling you about, was to reach out into what we could call mainstream computer science. So there have long been some notable figures in computer science. I'll mention one, Greg Vanderheiden in the University of Wisconsin, who's been working on technology and disability for a long time. But realistically, most mainstream computer scientists don't think about this space at all. So I had the opportunity to spend some time at NIDLR working with Ruth Brannon and others over the last few years. And one of the things I learned in talking with my colleagues in computer science is that typically they don't know at all about that agency and its research programs. And if they do know about it, what they think they know is that there's no place for them there, that it's not an activity that they can get involved in. So we've been working for a while on ways to kind of push back against that situation. So what we're going to try to do in this session is to give you an idea about what this workshop was. And then we hope to use most of the time to really talk with all of you about your ideas about how we can all promote the aims of that workshop. So let's see the next thing up here.
And
one thing you've got the clicker.
Did I? Okay. Did I break it? Oh, there we go. Okay.
Okay.
This button makes it stop working. Just FYI, if you ever get one of these. Yeah, please go ahead, Clayton.
Yeah, so this is that's the title of this workshop. It was held just a few weeks ago at the NIDLR headquarters in Washington, D.C. So one of the things we were happy to be able to do is to bring a bunch of people that, as I was just saying, don't know about this agency, to kind of bring them there. John Shida, who's the director of NIDLR, gave some terrific opening remarks there. But we need to, of course, acknowledge the sponsorship here, which is a little bit complicated. Some of you might know about these organizations. Well, certainly everybody knows about the National Science Foundation. So the National Science Foundation provided funding to an organization called the Computing Research Association, which in turn operates a program called the Computing Community Consortium, or CCC. So it's NSF money granted to CRA to operate this program called CCC. CRA is the Trade Association for Computer Science Research. So it's mostly research universities that participate, but some of the major industrial organizations participate as well. One of the main activities of the CCC is what they call visioning. So those of you in or outside computer science may recognize this or not, but while the world tends to think of computer science research as very cutting edge and forward-looking and strategic and all that, many people in the community looking inward feel we're kind of slipping in that respect. We've kind of fallen into ruts, and maybe we're not thinking the big thoughts and having the big ideas, which the field certainly deserves and needs. And the CCC's charter is to really push on that, to sponsor a variety of activities to take a more strategic look at opportunities across the landscape of computing research. So Sean and I saw this as an opportunity to make something happen in the areas of interest to us, technology and disability. So we were successful in getting support from CCC to put on that workshop. So.
Yeah. So just to get a sense of, since we have a small, intimate group, who here, maybe show of hands, would consider themselves a researcher or doing research as part of their work? All right, I know. I can do a consistency check. All right. Yeah. How about as a practitioner? Okay, and an end user of assistive technology or an advocate? All right, who do we miss? Okay, just curious, yeah. So one of the things we tried to do with this workshop really was, capture the energy that is happening in computing research and bring it a little bit down to earth in addressing some of these issues. So I think we talked about this goal really in terms of folks who came. So it was about 40 participants. So academic researchers, representatives from mostly industry and technology. So we had Yahoo, IBM, and then as Clayton said, the national agencies. And again, folks who had never really thought about this issue or hadn't much, and then people who were really embedded in this world.
Yeah, to say a little bit more about that last point. So when we would send an invitation to somebody, a number of people said, "Who, me?"
Right.
Or there must be some mistake. Why would you be asking me? I don't work on disability. So we had to really push to get people to realize, well, yeah, just because you've not been thinking about that now doesn't mean A, that you couldn't be, but B, we felt people had something to contribute, because there are many technologies that people are working on that don't have anything uniquely to do with disabilities, but could have an especially valuable role, we felt. And actually, I have to say, we were unsuccessful in some cases. There were some cases where even as hard as we worked to get people to realize, your work could really be important for people with disabilities, there were people who basically didn't think this was for them. So we still have work to do, for sure.
Okay. So we came up with an initial list of, 6 topics. We had a rotate number. And then we had, I think, 3 here that we're primarily going to talk about. But do you want to summarize the topics?
Yeah, so the topics came partly from things that we kind of came into the process thinking that it would make sense for a group like this to talk about. And then the list of topics was shaped by who actually accepted our invitation. So which topics did we feel that we could do a good job of? And the ones we're going to highlight, there's one that's kind of obvious for the audience here at this conference. And again, I think we've already suggested, if not said, that this is a broad cross-disability effort. So we weren't trying to work on particular areas. But for this audience, we obviously want to say something about the discussion on that point there about textual content for people with language and learning disabilities. But then, for different reasons, we wanted to highlight the 2 other points there. But if any of you have a particular interest in any of these other topics, we can, of course, have a conversation about what sorts of things were discussed there.
And one of the things I do want to mention is, so as an outcome of this workshop, we're preparing a white paper that would describe, capture all of these groups. And so, so we had experts in the subject areas working over this course of 2 days to discuss issues in this space. And we're now preparing that report. And so what you're getting here is a little bit of the late-breaking results of, what did these folks think was important? What were the challenges that they really thought were worth exploring? So I think we're going to summarize a few of these. There's also, I'll say a little bit about, there was an ad hoc session. So someone said, oh, well, we really need to talk about 3D printing and fabrication tools as they relate to accessibility. So we can say a little bit about that as well.
Okay, so as Sean mentioned, this is a fast-breaking. The white paper editorial process is underway, and we're a long way from having that finished off. So what we've done is to cull some things from the scribal notes that we're taking during the workshop, and give you a view there. So in this area of access to textual content, the breakout group split things out according to sort of on a spectrum from near term to more strategic. So you can see a range of things there. So on the near term heading, it was felt we had natural language processing experts there. They felt that it was within fairly immediate grasp to identify key terms in a textual passage so that those could be identified for the benefit of a reader who could then use those to make a judgment about what the topic of a text was. So many of you will know that many people with cognitive language or learning disabilities benefit from auditory presentation of text, but frequently that's time consuming and it's difficult to kind of skip through material based on an auditory presentation. So a technology that makes it possible for someone to identify what a passage of text is about, that allows them then to make a decision, okay, this is something I really want to go through in a more time-consuming way. So this is technology that in effect could help people who have very limited ability today to skim text. And then another related point there is it was the judgment of the gathered people that the technology should be available today to make text-to-speech technology available everywhere. So the way it is now, it's spotty. It may be difficult to set up and manage. So the thinking was this isn't so much a research challenge as it is a development challenge to push the development of tools out there to make text-to-speech more generally and easily available. Then moving out into the medium terms there, you can see there's a range of topics, simplification of syntax. Syntax-based formatting is something that's been out there for a while but has not really become generally available. So there is evidence that people for whom reading is a challenge are aided if the actual layout of text reflects the syntactic structure of what's being said there. And you can see a bunch of other, actually down at the bottom there is another one that in part this is available technology and it's starting to happen, but in part there's a research frontier that's identified there. So you may be seeing, because it's interesting, at least as I am experiencing things, every now and then I'm doing some familiar activity and then I find out, oh my gosh, I left my mouse on this word and I'm getting a definition of it. That's something, some of you know Nancy Ward, who's a prominent self-advocate. This has been on the top of Nancy's personal wish list for some time, so it's great to see that it's coming true. Easy access to definition of words. The research frontier there is making those definitions contextually appropriate, because we all know that most words have a great many meanings, and the meaning that's relevant in a particular case depends on the context in which that's being used. So that's a further research step that the folks working on this identified. So we can go to the next thing. So here are the grand challenges, and actually it was a bias in putting the workshop together. This is the kind of thing we really wanted to emphasize. We think there's going to be value in the shorter term challenges that people identified, but in trying to shape the agenda of funding agencies, which is what a lot of this is about, we want to be getting out ahead of the curves on these things. So we're particularly interested in these longer term kinds of challenges. So the one at the top there is semantic simplification. So this is not just restructuring sentences syntactically to make them easy to read. This is a much tougher challenge. This is saying, can you really pull out what the most important meaning aspects of something would be, and give a presentation that's really only including those main points. And I'll just make a comment. Some of you may be following what's happening in the machine translation world. So there's been enormous progress there, and actually I personally and some other people I know were guilty of making a simple mistake in understanding the meaning of those technology advances. So I actually wrote a proposal at one time in which I said, if we can translate English to Chinese, we should be able to translate English to simplified English. Sounds pretty good, I dare say. It turns out it's based on a real misapprehension. So translation is meaning preserving. So the point of translating English to Chinese is to preserve all of that meaning. Simplification isn't meaning preserving. It requires judgment to determine what are the most important points here, because a simplified presentation doesn't try to present everything. And that difference really matters in terms of the research that's going on. So there are a lot of statistical techniques and so on that are quite successful for machine translation in the meaning preserving sense, which really aren't applicable to this. So that's why this is in the grand challenge category. Another idea there, I mentioned Greg Vanderheiden earlier. One of many visionary ideas that Greg has put out is something that has the informal name, the InfoBot. And the concept of this technology is that it is able to automatically process any presentation of information that a majority of human readers could process. So it's not everything, but it's things, if it's something that a general human audience could understand, then the InfoBot has to be able to understand it. That's part of the objective. But then what it can do is to represent that content in whatever form that's needed. So this is a very ambitious aim compared with what we are now. So for example, to use an application of this from the space of visual access, many of you will know that today access for screen reader users is dependent on people correctly marking up their documents, and many people don't do that. The InfoBot would mean that if somebody produced material, whether marked up correctly or not, that could be comprehended by half of the human population, then the InfoBot would be capable of understanding that using whatever cues human beings use to understand it, and then represent it so that it could be made available to screen reader users without requiring, as today, that people have used the appropriate kind of markup. So an ambitious but obviously quite powerful goal. Actually, let me just talk briefly about the question answering thing. And this is a case where we think we see the kind of opportunity we were hoping for here to really connect with some research that's going on out there by people who are not really thinking about disability at all. So some of you know about the IBM Watson project, which got a whole lot of press by winning Jeopardy or whatever. That's an example of leading edge work on question answering. This breakout group identified that a question answering interface could be part of an approach for making information more inclusive. So rather than requiring someone to process text looking for an answer, they could say, well, what I really want to know from this text is, am I eligible for this waiver? And a question answering interface could allow them to get the answer to that without having to actually process themselves all of the text that's involved there. So an interesting idea, and one which, again, connects with some leading edge research that's out there.
Right. So being a little bit mindful of the time, which I think maybe only I can see.
Okay.
So I guess we have infinite time, but we actually don't. I'll say a little bit about the other breakout sessions, which connect to the broader themes of cognitive accessibility, but maybe perhaps not as directly. So we had a breakout session about the accessibility of games and interactive simulations. And to just briefly summarize what came up there, I think I would say there are a few challenges. And one is really thinking about how something that's interactive is constructed and really understanding the process of developing a game, developing a simulation. But also understanding what is key about the qualities of making an effective simulation or an effective game. And one piece of that from the cognitive space is thinking about how do we create an abstraction, right? So if we have an interactive simulation, say, of a physics lab experiment where you're bouncing balls and recording data, well, how do we represent that in other, the lesson of that in other formats, or the experience of doing that in other formats, and abstracting away what's going on in terms of really understanding what objects exist, what's important, and how one interacts with them. And we had quite a lot of people who had developed simulations and games, and so there was much more of the practical, where the rubber meets the road of saying, well, that's not how we really design games, and that's not how we design simulations currently. We do it much more directly, and so so making these changes at some level involves understanding tools and making better tools, but also education and outreach to developers and the kind of community of users who might advocate for a different way of creating these simulations, or the adapters, or what our group called the glue, that kind of often take these existing artifacts and help translate them or help figure out how to translate them into a more accessible form. There was quite a lot of discussion about representation of people with disabilities within games and simulations as well. That being quite conclusively shown that in other areas related to diversity, so representing gender diversity or ethnic diversity, can have huge impacts on especially students and becoming engaged with these topics and making sure that that's right there. And the last thing I'll say about that is about this is just this notion of, well, we talked about, well, what does make a good game? What makes a good simulation? And there are often elements that are in conflict with what we might think of being part of good accessible design. So one that came up was this notion of surprise. A good game is one that surprises you, or a good simulation is one that shows you something that's surprising. And often the notion of surprise is something that we try to minimize when we're doing accessible design. So there are some questions there about how to balance some of these tensions. And in terms of the short-term, medium-term, and long-term goals, one of the takeaways here was we still don't really have good exemplars of what these systems might be. We don't have good exemplars of universally accessible games and simulations that we can then perhaps use to derive some of these guidelines.
Yeah, I'll just mention one aspect here that also was part of what Sean was just showing you. So there's the research, there's the developments in the technology, and then there's how you kind of frame a long-term research campaign. And increasingly across a range of agencies, people are having success with benchmark-driven research. So instead of just anybody proposes whatever they want to work on and reviewers evaluate it and so on, the notion is let's create a framework for long-term research. So in this space, federal agencies are publishing lots of data sets for all kinds of good reasons. As a rule, they're not able today to do that in an accessible manner. So the notion would be, let's choose some data sets of public interest. Let's create a benchmarking facility that takes care of things like recruiting people with disabilities to participate in evaluations of this technology, so that the technologists can do what they're best at, which is try to come up with new ways of doing this, and the work of evaluating and measuring progress can be handled by a sort of a framework entity. So this is an idea, obviously, that needs to be explored further, but there was a good deal of interest in this, in part because today, like if we go back to that picture, computer scientists not seeing there's something for them to do here, well, partly they're right. They don't have the skills, they don't have the connections, they don't have the relations to the community necessary to really push all of this along. So there's a proposal here, well, maybe we can provide a structure that would mean that technologists can do what they do in presenting technology. It can be evaluated in an appropriate way in the community without requiring them to kind of do all of that. And of course, a part of that would be, this is now a framework in which we could ensure on a consistent basis that people with cognitive disabilities were included in these assessments, which rarely happens today, in part because of reasons that many of us are familiar with. It's not an easy thing to develop the right relationships and secure this kind of participation and to do appropriate evaluation. So interesting prospect for a different division of labor in the future.
Mm-hmm. So I think in the interest of time, we've got, our light just went from green to yellow. We've got a couple
we don't know what that actually
means. We don't
means,
actually,
but anyway.
But one thing I want to say, about this discussion here was really, that there's a lot of discussion about big data and how do we make that accessible. And one piece that I think might be particularly relevant to this audience is the discussion of being able to interact with this data and have access to it and make sense of it as really being a core life skill, right? So part of independent living is really being able to look at data and make conclusions about it. And so that was one area that came up in this workshop, and particularly looking at, I think science data came up, but also more everyday life kinds of issues like weather data was something that came up. And a lot of the themes that we discussed before about being able to query and ask questions about data sets, being able to represent it in whatever forms and whatever support is valuable were the things that bubbled up. I'll just say a few comments about maps and 3D printing. So these were topics that emerged during the workshop as being particularly salient in that they kept coming up, but we did not actually plan a session about them. And I would say the major challenges that came up here is there's a lot of energy in particularly thinking about 3D printing and other kinds of tools to help individuals make assistive technology, to make their own assistive technology, but currently the tools for supporting that just do not exist, and do not exist in a way that is accessible. And in general, this theme of really here thinking about customization. So we also are talking about maps and supporting kind of independent navigation across disabilities, and to really take this to the next level beyond where we are. The theme that kept coming up was we really need to be able to capture information about individuals and their behaviors and their preferences. So having an accessible map or giving accessible navigation directions is not just about what routes are accessible, but also understanding the individual's preferences, their behaviors, their abilities, whatever factors are relevant. All right, so, and we'll talk about next steps.
Yeah, so as mentioned, there is a white paper that's in the editorial process now. It will be circulated to all the workshop participants. Oh, actually, I was just going to refer to Bob Bond, who was at the workshop, but he's split. Oh, he moved. Yeah, okay. So the editorial process will include circulating drafts to all of the participants. Incidentally, the participants were there on a not for individual attribution basis. So it's not going to be, Bob Bond said X or Y, but nevertheless, it's important, obviously, that all the participants feel happy with the report. And then we want to push this out widely, and any of you who are interested and willing to help push this out going forward, if you can let us know, we'd be happy to involve you in this. So what we're doing here is an example of talking about this work here. We hope to do that at future conferences. There's some interesting things happening in the agencies. So one thing is, some of you will know of something called the Interagency Committee on Disability Research. That's existed for many years. It's evolving, and one of the things that's happening as part of that evolution is that there's an interagency planning process for disability research. So we're certainly going to be doing all we can to make sure our white paper gets to those folks in a form that's useful to them. We're also hoping to involve advocacy groups. We did have some advocates participating, but we hope to reach out to a wider group. Some of you will know Bill Schutz at NIDLR. Bill has offered to help us in particular in this area of putting our white paper conclusions in a form that people in advocacy groups will find useful, helping them to communicate about how these research goals relate to actual concrete human needs, which is something that's easy for academics to lose sight of. So we're grateful to Bill for his offer of help there. And then connecting back to what I opened with, some of you may have been at last year's conference where we had a discussion of this idea of private-public partnerships. We think this research agenda goes way beyond what academics can really do effectively, but more than that, if we leave the agenda in the hands of just academic researchers, the path to real implementation and really impacting people's lives is going to be a long one. If we can get the industry groups, the Yahoos, the IBMs, fully involved in this research, it's really going to shorten the time to when we see the fruits of these things actually out in the marketplace, which is obviously what the aim is.